Hello, and welcome to Struggle Sessions. This is going to be readings of various Marxist literature, and I'm going to be posting these as often as possible. I hope to keep this as a weekly program. Today we will be reading Critique of the Gotha Program. This is by Karl Marx. This is the version to be found on Marxist.org. The foreword. The manuscript published here, the covering letter to Bracke as well as the critique of the draft program, was sent in 1875, shortly before the Gotha Unity Congress, to Bracke for communication. To Gieb, Auer, Bebel, and Liebknecht had subsequent return to Marx, since the Halle Party Congress has put the discussion of the Gotha program on the agenda to the party. I think I would be guilty of suppression if I any longer withheld from publicity this important, perhaps the most important document relevant to this discussion. But the manuscript has yet another and far more far-reaching significance. Here, for the first time, Marx's attitude to the line adopted by Lassalle in his agitation from the very beginning is clearly and firmly set forth, both as regards to Lassalle's economic principles and his tactics. The ruthless severity with which the draft program is dissected here, the mercilessness with which the results obtained are enunciated, and the shortcomings of the draft laid bare, all this today, after 15 years, can no longer give offense. Specific Lassallians now exist only abroad in isolated ruins. And in Halle, the Gotha program was given up even by its creators as altogether inadequate. Nevertheless, I have omitted a few sharp personal expressions and judgments where these were immaterial and replaced them by dots. Marx himself would have done so if he had published the manuscript today. The violence of the language in some passages was provoked by two circumstances. In the first place, Marx and I had been more intimately connected with the German movement than with any other. We were therefore bound to be particularly perturbed by the decidedly retrograde step manifested by this draft program. And secondly, we were at the time, hardly 2 years after the Hague Conference of the International, engaged in the most violent struggle against Bakunin and his anarchists, who made us responsible for everything that happened in the labor movement in Germany. Hence, we had to expect that we would also be addled with the secret paternity of this program. These considerations do not now exist, and so there is no necessity for the passages in question. For reasons arising from press law, also a few sentences have been indicated only by dots. Where I have had to choose a milder expression, this has been enclosed in square brackets. Otherwise, the text has been reproduced word for word. That was Engels, London, January 6th, 1891. This section covers Marx to Bracke. London, 5th of May, 1875. Dear Bracke, when you have read the following critical marginal notes on the Unity program, would you be so good as to send them to Gieb and Auer and Bebel and Liebknecht for examination? I am exceedingly busy and have to overstep by far the limit of work allowed me by the doctors. Hence, it was anything but a pleasure to write such a lengthy screed. It was, however, necessary so that the steps to be taken by me later on would not be misinterpreted by our friends in the party whom this communication is intended. After the party congress has been held, Engels and I will publish a short statement to the effect that our position is altogether remote from the said program of the principle, and that we have nothing to do with it. This is indispensable because the opinion, the entirely erroneous opinion, is held abroad and assiduously nurtured by enemies of the party that we secretly guide from here the movement of the so-called Eisenach party. In a Russian book, Statism and Anarchy, that has recently appeared, Bakunin still makes me responsible, for example, not only for all the programs, etc., of that party, but even for every step taken by Liebknecht from the day of his cooperation with the People's Party. Apart from this, it is my duty not to give recognition, even by diplomatic silence, to what my opinion is as a thoroughly objectionable program that demoralizes the party. Every step of real movement is more important than a dozen programs. If, therefore, it was not possible and the conditions of the item did not permit it to go beyond the Eisenach program, one should simply have concluded an agreement for action against the common enemy. But by drawing up a program of principles instead of postponing this until it has been prepared for by a considerable period of common activity, one sets up before the whole world landmarks by which it measures the level of the party movement. The Lassallean leaders became circumstances forced them to. If they had been told in advance that there would be haggling about principles, they would have had to be content with a program of action or a plan of organization for common action. Instead of this, one permits them to arrive armed with mandates, recognizes these mandates on one's part as binding, and thus surrenders unconditionally to those who are themselves in need of help. To crown the whole business, they are holding a Congress before the Congress of Compromise, while one's own party is holding its Congress post festum. One had obviously had a desire to stifle all criticism and to give one's own party no opportunity for reflection. One knows that the mere fact of unification is satisfying to the workers, but it is a mistake to believe that this momentary success is not bought too dearly. For the rest, the program is no good, even apart from its sanctification of Lassallean articles of faith. I shall be sending you in the near future the last parts of the French edition of Capital. The printing was held up for a considerable time by a ban of the French government. The thing will be ready this week or the beginning of next week. Have you received the previous 6 parts? Please let me have the address of Bernhard Becker, to whom I must also send the final parts. The bookshop of the Volksstadt has peculiar ways of doing things. Up to this moment, for example, I have not been sent a single copy of Cologne Communist Trial. With best regards, yours, Karl Marx. This next section is a letter from Engels to August Bebel in Zwickau. London, March 18th to 28th, 1875. Dear Bebel, I have received your letter of February 23rd, and am glad to hear that you are in such good bodily health. You ask me what we think of the unification affair. We are unfortunately in exactly the same boat as yourself. Neither Liebknecht nor anyone else has let us have any kind of information, and hence we know only what is in the papers. Not that there was anything in them until a week or so ago, when the draft program appeared. That astonished us not a little, I must say. Our party had so often held out the conciliatory hand to the Lassalleans, or at least proffered cooperation, only to be rebuffed so often and so contemptuously by the Hassencleavers, Hasselmans, and Tolks, as to lead any child to the conclusion that should these gentlemen now come and themselves proffer conciliation, they must be in a hell of a dilemma, knowing full well that these people are like. However, it behooves us to make the most of that dilemma and insist on every conceivable guarantee that might prevent these people from restoring, at our party's expense, their shattered reputation in general working-class opinion. They should be given an exceedingly cool and cautious reception, and union be made dependent on the degree of their readiness to abandon their sectarian slogans and their state aid, and to accept in its essentials the Eisenach program of 1869, or an improved edition of it, adapted to the present day. Our party has absolutely nothing to learn from the Lassalleans in the theoretical sphere, i.e. the crux of the matter where the program is concerned, but the Lassalleans doubtless have something to learn from the party. The first prerequisite for union was that they cease to be sectarians, Lassalleans, i.e., that first and foremost they should, if not wholly relinquish the universal panacea of state aid, at least admit it to a secondary provisional measure alongside and amongst many others recognized as possible. The draft program shows that our people, while infinitely superior to the Lasallian leaders in matters of theory, are far from being a match for them where political guile is concerned. Once again, the quote-unquote honest men have been cruelly done in the eye by the dishonest. To begin with, they adopt the high-sounding but historically false Lasallian dictum. In relation to the working class, all other classes are only one reactionary mass. This proposition is true only in certain exceptional instances. For example, in the case of a revolution by the proletariat, e.g. the Commune, or in a country which not only has the bourgeois constructed state and society after its own image, but the democratic petty bourgeoisie in its wake, has already carried that reconstruction to its logical conclusion. If, for instance, in Germany, the democratic petty bourgeoisie were part of this reactionary mass, then how could the Social Democratic Workers' Party gone hand in hand with it, with the People's Party, for years on end? How could the Volksstaat derive virtually all its political content from the petty bourgeois democratic Frankfurter Zeitung? And how can one explain the adoption of this same program to no less than 7 demands that coincide exactly and word for word with the program of the People's Party and of petty bourgeois democracy? I mean the 7 political demands, 1 to 5 and 1 to 2, of which there is not one that is not bourgeois democratic. Secondly, the principle that the workers' movement is an international one is to all intents and purposes utterly denied in respect of the present, and this by men who, for the space of 5 years and under the most difficult conditions, upheld that principle in the most laudable manner. The German workers' position in the van of the European movement rests essentially on their genuinely international attitude during the war. No other proletariat would have behaved so well, and now this principle is to be denied by them at a moment where everywhere abroad workers are stressing it all the more by reason of the efforts made by governments to suppress every attempt at its practical application in an organization. And what is left of the internationalism of workers' movement? The dim prospect, not even of subsequent cooperation among European workers with a view to their liberation, nay, but of a future international brotherhood of peoples, but your Peace League bourgeois United States of Europe. There was, of course, no need whatever to mention the International as such, but at the very least there should have been no going back to the program of 1869 and some sort of statement to the effect that though first of all the German Workers' Party is acting within limits set by its political frontiers, it has no right to speak in the name of the European proletariat, especially when it says it's wrong. It is nevertheless conscious of its solidarity with the workers of all other countries and will, as before, always be ready to meet the obligations that solidarity entails. Such obligations, even if one does not definitely proclaim or regard oneself as part of the international, consist of, for example, in aid, abstention from blacklegging during strikes, making sure that the party organs keep German workers informed of the movement abroad, agitation against impending or incipient dynastic wars. During such wars, an attitude such as was exemplary maintained in 1870 and 1871, etc. Thirdly, our people have allowed themselves to be saddled with the Lasallian iron law of wages, which is based on a completely outmoded economic view, namely that on average the workers receive only the minimum wage because, according to the Malthusian theory of population, there are always too many workers, such as was Lassalle's reasoning. Now, in Capital, Marx has amply demonstrated that the laws governing wages are very complex, that according to circumstances now this law now holds sway, that they are therefore by no means iron, but are on the contrary exceedingly elastic, and that the subject really cannot be dismissed in a few words as Lassalle imagined. Malthus's argument, upon which the law Lassalle derived from him, and Ricardo, whom he misrepresented, is based, as the argument appears, for instance, on page 5 of the Arbeiterlesebruch, where it is quoted from another pamphlet of Lassalle's, is exhaustively refuted by Marx in the section on accumulation of capital. Thus, by adopting the Lassallean iron law, one commits oneself to a false proposition and false reasoning in support of the same. Fourthly, as it one and only social demand, the program puts forward Lassallean state aid in its starkest form, as stolen by Lassalle from Bucquet's, and this after Bracke has so ably demonstrated the sheer futility of that demand, after almost all, if not all, of our party speakers have, in their struggle against the Lassalleans, been compelled to make a stand against this state aid. Our party could hardly demean itself further. Internationalism sunk to the level of Amand Gog, socialism to that of bourgeois Republican Bouquets, who confronted the socialists with its demand in order to supplant them. But state aid, in the Lassallean sense of the word, is, after all, at most, only one measure among many others for the attainment of an end here lamely described as paving the way for the solution of the social question, as though in our case there were still a social question that remained unsolved in theory. Thus, if you were to say the German Workers' Party strives to abolish wage labor and hence class distinctions by introducing cooperative production into industry and agriculture, and on a national scale, it is in favor of any measure calculated to attain that end, then no Lassallean could possibly object. Fifthly, there is no mention of the organization of the working class as a class through the medium of trade unions, and that is a point of the utmost importance, this being the proletariat's true class organization, in which it fights daily battles with capital, in which it trains itself, in which nowadays can no longer simply be smashed, even with reaction at its worst, as presently in Paris. Considering the importance of this organization is likewise assuming in Germany, it would, in our view, be indispensable to accord it some mention in the program and possibly to leave some room for it in the organization of the party. A side note here, this is long before imperialism had developed and the unionization process attached to the bourgeois class. So we have a difference between today, genuine revolutionary unions and reactionary professional unions. All these things have been done by our people to oblige the Lassalleans. And what have the others conceded? That a host of somewhat muddled and purely democratic demands should figure in the program, some of them being of a purely fashionable nature. For instance, legislation by the people, such as exists in Switzerland, and does more harm than good, if it can be said to do anything at all. Administration by the people, that would at least be something. Similarly omitted is the first prerequisite of all liberty, that all officials be responsible for their official actions to every citizen before the ordinary courts and in accordance with common law, that demands such as freedom of science and freedom of conscience figure in every liberal bourgeois program and seem trifle out of place with here is something I shall not enlarge upon. The free people's state is transformed into the free state. Grammatically speaking, a free state is one in which the state is free vis-a-vis its citizens, a state, that is, with a despotic government. All the palaver about the state ought to be dropped, especially after the Commune, which had ceased to be a state in the true sense of the term. The people's state has been flung in our teeth ad nauseum by the anarchists. Although Marx's anti-Proudhon piece and after it the Communist Manifesto declare outright that with the introduction of the socialist order of society, the state will dissolve of itself and disappear. Now, since the state is merely a transitional institution of which use is made in the struggle, in the revolution, to keep down one's enemies by force, it is utter nonsense to speak of a free people's state so long as the proletariat still makes use of the state. It makes use of it not for the purpose of freedom, but of keeping down its enemies, and soon as there can be any question of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist. We would therefore suggest that Gemeinwesen, commonality, be universally substituted for state. It is a good old German word that can very well do service for the French Commune. The elimination of all social and political inequality rather than the abolition of all class distinctions is similarly a most dubious expression, as between one country, one province, and even one place and another, living conditions will always evince a certain inequality which may be reduced to a minimum but never wholly eliminated. The living conditions of alpine dwellers will always be different from those of the plainsmen. The concept of a socialist society as a realm of equality is a one-sided French concept deriving from the old liberty, equality, fraternity, a concept which was justified in its own time and place. It signified a phase of development, but which, like all the one-sided ideas of earlier socialist schools, ought now to be suspended, since they produce nothing but mental confusion, and more accurate ways of presenting the matter have been discovered. I shall desist, although almost every word in this program, a program which is moreover insipidly written, lays itself open to criticism. It is such that, should it be adopted, Marx and I could never recognize a new party set up on that basis, and shall have to consider most seriously what attitude, public as well as private, we should adopt towards it. Remember that abroad we are held responsible for any and every statement and action of the German Social Democratic Workers' Party by Bakunin in his work Statehood and Anarchy, in which we are made to answer for every injudicious word spoken or written by Liebknecht since the inception of the Demokratische Wochenblatt. People imagine that we run the whole show from here, whereas you know as well as I do that we have hardly ever interfered in the least with internal party affairs. And then only in an attempt to make good as far as possible that we considered to have been blunders, and only theoretical blunders at that. But as you yourself will realize, this program marks a turning point which may very well force us to renounce any kind of responsibility in regard to the party that adopts it. Generally speaking, less importance attaches to the official program of a party than to what it does, but a new program is after all a banner planted in public, and the outside world judges the party by it. Hence, whatever happens there should be no going back, as there is here, or the Eisenach program. It should further be considered that what the workers of other countries will think of this program, what impression will be created by this genuflection of the part of the entire German socialist proletariat before Lassalleanism. I am moreover convinced that a union on this basis would not last a year. Are the best minds of our party to descend into repeating parrot fashion Lassallean maxims concerning the iron law of wages and state aid? I'd like to see you, for one, thus employed. And were they to do so, their audiences would hiss them off the stage, and I feel sure that it is precisely of these bits of the program that the Lassalleans are assisting, like Shylock the Jew on his pound of flesh. The split will come, but we have made honest men again of Hasselmann, Hassencleaver, and Tolk and Company. We shall emerge from the split weaker and the Lassalleans stronger. Our party will have lost its political virginity and will never again be able to come wholeheartedly against Lassallean maxims, which for a time it inscribed its own banner, and then should the Lassalleans again declare themselves to be the sole and most genuine workers' party, and our people to the bourgeoisie, the program would be there to prove it. All the socialist measures in it are theirs, and our party has introduced nothing save the demands of that petty bourgeois democracy, which it has itself described in that program as part of the reactionary mass. I had held this letter back in view of the fact that you would only be released on April 1st in honor of Bismarck's birthday, not wanting to expose it to the risk of interception in course of an attempt to smuggle it in. Well, I have just had a letter from Bracke, who also felt grave doubts about the program and asked our opinion. I shall therefore send this letter to him, forwarding so that he can read it without having to write the whole thing over again. I have, by the way, also spoken my mind to Rahm, to Liebknecht. I wrote but briefly. I cannot forgive his not having told us a single word about the whole business, whereas Rahm and others believed he had given us exact information, until it was a manner of speaking too late. True, this has always been his wont, hence the large amount of disagreeable correspondence with we, both Marx and myself, have had with him. But this time it is really too bad, and we definitely shan't act in concert with him. Do see that you manage to come here in the summer. You would, of course, stay with me, and if the weather is fine, we might spend a day or two taking sea baths, which would really do good for you after a long spell in jail. Ever your friend, Frederick Ingalls. Marx has just moved house. He is living in 41 Maitland Park Crescent, northwest London. So, as a note, we see here in this letter to Bebel that Engels and Marx are having a problem with the Lassallians. The Lassallians are basically the democratic socialists of their day. They thought that it would be possible through universal suffrage, essentially bourgeois democracy, to achieve socialism. So you can see the people that argue for this kind of stuff today are just repeating the exact same arguments that were settled, really, or should have been settled, rather, well over a century ago. Almost 2 centuries ago at this point. So now we get to the critique of the Gotha program proper. This is Marx's work. Labor is the source of all wealth and culture. Labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values, and it is surely of that material with wealth consists as labor, which itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. The above phrase is to be found in all children's primers, and is correct insofar as it implied that labor is performed with the apurient subjects and instruments. But a socialist program cannot allow such bourgeois phrases to pass over in silence the conditions that alone give them meaning. And insofar as a man from the beginning behaves towards nature, the primary source of all instruments and subject of labor, as an owner, treats her as belonging to him. His labor becomes the source of use values, therefore also of wealth. The bourgeois have very good friends for falsely ascribing supernatural creative power to labor, since precisely from the fact that labor depends on nature, it follows that the man who possesses no property than his labor power must, in all conditions of society and culture, be slave of other men who have made themselves the owners of the material conditions of labor. He can only work with their permission, hence live only with their permission. Let us now leave the sentence as it stands, or rather limps. What could one have expected in conclusion? Obviously this. Since labor is the source of all wealth, no one in society can appropriate wealth except as the product of labor. Therefore, if he himself does not work, he lives by the labor of others, and also acquires his culture at the expense of the labor of others. Instead of this, by means of verbal rigor, and since a proposition is added in order to draw the conclusion from this and not from the first one. Useful labor is possible only in society and through society. According to this first proposition, labor was the source of all wealth and culture. Therefore, no society is possible without labor. Now we learn, conversely, that no useful labor is possible without society. One could just as well have said that only in society can useless and even socially harmful labor become a branch of gainful occupation. That only in society can one live by being idle, etc., etc. In short, once could just have well as copied the whole of Rousseau. And what is useful labor? Surely only labor which produces the intended useful result, a savage. And man was a savage after he had ceased to be an ape, who kills an animal with a stone, who collects fruit, etc., performs useful labor. Thirdly, the conclusion, useful labor is possible only in society, and through society, the proceeds of labor belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society. A fine conclusion. If useful labor is possible only in society and through society, the proceeds of the labor belong to society, and only so much therefrom accrues to the individual worker as is not required to maintain the condition of labor in society. In fact, this proposition has at all times been made use of by the champions of the state of society prevailing at any given time. First comes the claims of the government and everything that sticks to it, since the social organ for the maintenance of the social order. Then comes the claims of the various kinds of private property, for the various kinds of private property are the foundations of society, etc. One sees that such hollow phrases are the foundation of society, etc. One sees that such hollow phrases can be twisted and turned as desired. The first and second parts of the paragraph have some intelligible connection only in the following wording. Labor becomes the source of wealth and culture only as social labor, or what is the same thing, in and through society. This proposition is incontestably correct. For although isolated labor, its material conditions presuppose, can create value, it can create neither wealth nor culture. But equally incontestable is this other proposition. In proportion as labor develops socially and becomes thereby a source of wealth and culture, poverty and destitution develop among the workers, and wealth and culture among the non-workers. This is the law of all history hitherto. What therefore had to be done here, instead of setting down general phrases about labor and society, was to prove concretely how in the present capitalist society, the material, etc., conditions have at last been created which enable and compel the workers to lift this social curse. In fact, however, the whole paragraph, bungled in style and content, is only there in order to inscribe the Lassallean catchword of undiminished proceeds of labor as a slogan at the top of the party banner. I shall return later to the proceeds of labor, equal right, etc., since the same things recur in somewhat a different form further on. In present-day society, the instruments of labor are the monopoly of the capitalist class. The resulting dependence of the working class is the cause of misery and servitude in all forms. This sentence, borrowed from the rules of the International, is incorrect in this improved edition. In present-day society, the instruments of labor are the monopoly of the landowners. Monopoly of property and land is even the basis of monopoly of capital and the capitalist. In the passage in question, the rules of International do not mention either one or the other class of monopolists. They speak of the monopolizer of the means of labor, that is, the sources of life. The addition, sources of life, makes it sufficiently clear that land is included in the instruments of labor. The correction was introduced because Lassalle, for reasons now generally known, attacked only the capitalist class and not the landowners. In England, the capitalist class is usually not even the owner of the land on which the factory stands. Again, a side note on this, a lot of this has been merged through monopoly and finance capital, although the condition does still exist. For example, in my local area, a lot of the grocery stores, even the competing grocery stores, the land is owned by the larger chain in the area. So they actually lease the land out to rival grocery chains. 3. The emancipation of labor demands the promotion of the instruments of labor to common property of socially and the cooperative regulation of the total labor with a fair distribution of the proceeds of labor. I'm going to go back to Marx's comments. Promotion of the instruments of labor to the common property ought obviously to read their conversion into the common property, but this is only passing. He's nitpicking here. What are the proceeds of labor? The product of labor or its value. And in the latter case, it is the total value of the product or only that part of the value which labor has newly added to the value of the means of production consumed. Proceeds of labor is a loose notion which Lassalle has put in the place of definite economic conceptions. What is a fair distribution? Do not the bourgeois assert that the present-day distribution is fair? Anybody who's argued online with any sort of capitalist apologist see that line is taken up. And it is not, in fact, the only fair distribution on the basis of present-day mode of production. Are economic relations regulated by legal conceptions, or do not, on the contrary, legal relations arise out of economic ones? Have not also the socialist sectarians the most varied notions about fair distribution? To understand what is implied in this connection by the phrase fair distribution, we must take the first paragraph and this one together. The latter presupposes a society wherein the instruments of labor are common property, and the total labor is cooperatively regulated. And from the first paragraph, we learn that the proceeds of labor belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society. To all members of society? To those who do not work as well? What remains then of the undiminished proceeds of labor? Only to those members of society who work? What remains then of equal right of all members of society? But all members of society and equal right are obviously mere phrases. The kernel consists in this, that in this communist society, every worker must receive the undiminished Lassallean proceeds of labor. Let us take first of all the words proceeds of labor in the sense of the product of labor. Then the cooperative proceeds of labor are not the total social product. From this amount must be deducted, first, cover or replacement of the means of production used up. Second, additional portion for expansion of production. Third, reserve or insurance funds to provide against accidents, dislocations caused by natural calamities, etc. These deductions from the quote-unquote undiminished proceeds of labor are an economic necessity, and their magnitude is to be determined according to the available means and forces, partly by the computation of probabilities, but they are in no way calculable by equity. There remains in the other part of the total product intended to serve as means of consumption. Before this is divided among the individuals, there has to be deducted again from it first the general costs of administration not belonging to production. This part will, from the outset, be very considerably restricted in comparison with present-day society, and it diminishes in proportion as the new society develops. Second, that which is intended for the common satisfaction of needs, such as schools, health services, etc. From the outset, this part grows considerably in comparison with present-day society, and it grows in proportion as the new society develops. Third, funds for those unable to work, etc. In short, for what is included under so-called official poor relief today. So another side note here, general costs of administration not belonging to production, you could project that today as bureaucracy, political apparatus, so on, management. In communist society, this is going to be reduced, while social programs, education, health services, food, etc. will be increased. Only now do we come to the distribution which the program under Lassallean influence alone has in view of its narrow fashion, namely to that part of the means of consumption which is divided among the individual producers of the cooperative society. The undiminished proceeds of labor have already unnoticeably been converted into the diminished proceeds, although what the producer is deprived of in his capacity as a private individual benefits him directly or indirectly in this capacity as a member of society. Just as the phrase of quote-unquote undiminished proceeds of labor has disappeared, so now does the phrase of quote-unquote proceeds of labor disappear altogether. Within the cooperative society based on common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products. Just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products, as a material quality possessed by them, since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of total labor. The phrase, quote-unquote, proceeds of labor, objectionable also today on account of its ambiguity, thus loses all meaning. What we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect economically, morally, and intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. Accordingly, the individual producer receives back from society, after the deductions have been made, exactly what he gives to it, what he has given to it in his individual quantum of labor. For example, the social working day consists of the sum of individual hours of work. The individual labor time of the individual producer is part of the social working day contributed by him, his share in it. He receives a certificate from society that he has furnished such and such amount of labor, after deducting his labor from the common funds, and with this certificate he draws from social stock of means of consumption as much as the same amount of labor cost. The same amount of labor which he has given to society in one form, he receives back in another. So this is from each according to his ability, to each according to their contribution. Hence, equal right here is still in principle bourgeois right, although principle and practice are no longer at loggerheads, while the exchange of equivalents in commodity exchange exists only in the average and not in the individual case. In spite of this advance, the equal right is still constantly stigmatized by a bourgeois limitation. The right of producers is proportional to the labor they supply. The equality consists in the fact that measurement is made with an equal standard labor. But one man is superior to another physically or mentally and supplies more labor in the same time, or can forge labor for a longer time, and labor to serve as a measure must be defined by duration or intensity, otherwise it ceases to be a standard of measurement. This equal right is an unequal right for unequal labor. It recognizes no class differences because everyone is only a worker like everyone else, but it tacitly recognizes unequal individual endowment, and thus productive capacity as a natural privilege. It is therefore a right of inequality in its content like every right. Right by its very nature can consist only in the application of an equal standard, but unequal individuals. And they would not be different individuals if they were not unequal, are measurable only by an equal standard insofar as they are brought under an equal point of view, are taken from one definite side only. For instance, in the present case, are regarded only as workers and nothing more is seen in them. Everything else must be ignored. Further, one worker is married and another is not. One has more children than another, and so on and so forth. Thus, with an equal performance in labor, and hence an equal in the social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than another, one will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid these defects, right, instead of being equal, would have to be unequal. But these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it is when it just emerged after prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. I have dealt more at length with the undiminished proceeds of labor on one hand, and with equal right and fair distribution on the other, in order to show what a crime it is to attempt on one hand and force on our party again as dogmas, ideas which in certain period had some meaning but now have become obsolete verbal rubbish, while again perverting on the other the realistic outlook, which it costs so much effort to instill into the party, but which has now taken root in it by means of ideological nonsense about right and other trash so common among the Democrats and French socialists. Quite apart from the analysis so far given, it was in general a mistake to make a fuss about the so-called distribution, put the principal stress on it. Any distribution whatever of the means of consumption is only a consequence of the distribution of the conditions of production themselves. The latter distribution, however, is a feature of the mode of production itself. The capitalist mode of production, for example, rests on the fact that the material conditions of production are in the hands of non-workers in the form of property and capital and land, while the masses are only owners of the personal condition of production, of labor power. If the elements of production are so distributed, then the present-day distribution of the means of consumption results automatically. If the material conditions of production are the cooperative property of the workers themselves, then there likewise results a distribution of the means of consumption different from the present one. Vulgar socialism, and from it, in turn, a section of the Democrats, has taken over from the bourgeois economists the consideration and treatment of distribution as independent of the mode of production, and hence the presentation of socialism as turning principally on distribution, after the real relation has long been made clear. Why retrogress again? 4. The emancipation of labor must be the work of the working class, relative to which all other classes are only one reactionary mass. The first strophe is taken from the introductory words of the rules of the International, but improved. There it is said, the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the workers themselves. Here, on the contrary, the working class has to emancipate what? Labor. Let him understand who can. In compensation, the epistrophe, on the other hand, Lassallean quotation of the first water, relative to which, the working class, all other classes are only one reactionary mass. In the Communist Manifesto it is said, of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The bourgeoisie is here conceived as a revolutionary class, as the bearer of large-scale industry relative to the feudal lords and lower middle class who desire to maintain all social positions that are the creation or obsolete modes of production. Thus, they do not form together with the bourgeoisie only one reactionary mass. On the other hand, the proletariat is revolutionary relative to the bourgeoisie because, having itself grown up on the basis of large-scale industry, it strives to strip off from production the capitalist character that the bourgeoisie seeks to perpetuate. But the manifesto adds that the lower middle class is becoming revolutionary in view of its impending transfer to the proletariat. From this point of view, therefore, it is again nonsense to say that it, together with the bourgeoisie and with the feudal lords into the bargain, form one reactionary mass relative to the working class. Has one proclaimed to the artisans, small manufacturers, and peasants during the last elections, relative to us, you together with the bourgeoisie and feudal lords form one reactionary mass? Lassalle knew the Communist Manifesto by heart, as his faithful followers know the Gospels written by him. If, therefore, he has falsified it so grossly, this has occurred only to put a good color on his alliance with absolutist and feudal opponents against the bourgeoisie. So, a side note here, Lassalle had definite ties and economic interests in, at the time, the absolutist governments and feudal landowners. In the above paragraph, moreover, his oracular saying is dragged in by the main force without any connection with the botched quotation of the rules of the International. Thus, it is simply an impertinence and indeed not at all displeasing to Herr Bismarck, one of those cheap pieces of insolence in which the Marat of Berlin deals. So, another note on this, when Marx talks about the petit bourgeois, the lower classes, peasantry, and so on, having relationships that were still revolutionary, positions that were still revolutionary at this time, he was very much correct. As we've seen during revolutions, during the Russian and Chinese specifically, the peasantry and small bourgeoisie were definitely part of the coalition to overthrow the capitalist order. Though I would strike a note that these conditions alter as imperialism develops. Here in the United States, we have no peasantry. We do have what Marx would have called at his time a counter-revolutionary class, the lumpen proletariat. But here in the United States, we can see that the lumpen proletariat is not a reactionary class. If anything, these are former proletariats or would-be proletariats rather than the lumpen of Marx's day. Whereas, in many cases, the petit bourgeois in the imperial core countries have become a counter-revolutionary class. We can see this in practice by many of the backbones of the fascist movements of the 20th and 21st centuries have been from among the petit bourgeois in imperialist countries. 5. The working class strives for its emancipation first of all within the framework of the present-day national states, conscious that the necessary result of its efforts, which are common to the workers of all civilized countries, will be the international brotherhood of peoples. Lassalle, in opposition to the Communist Manifesto and to all earlier socialism, conceived the workers' movement from the narrowest nationalist standpoint. He is being followed in this and that after the work of the International. It is altogether self-evident to be able to fight at all, the working class must organize itself at home as a class, and that in its own country the immediate area of its struggle, insofar as the class struggle is national, not in substance, but as the Communist Manifesto says, in form. But the framework of present-day national state, for instance, the German Empire itself, in its turn economically within the framework of the world market, politically within the framework of the system of states, every businessman knows that German trade is at the same time foreign trade, and the greatness of Herr Bismarck consists, to be sure, precisely in pursuing a kind of international policy. And to what does the German Workers' Party reduce its internationalism? To the consciousness that the result of its efforts will be the international brotherhood of peoples, a phrase borrowed by the bourgeoisie League of Peace and Freedom, which is intended to pass as an equivalent to the international brotherhood of working classes in the joint struggle against the ruling classes and their governments. Not a word, therefore, about the international functions of the German working class. And it is thus that it is to challenge its own bourgeoisie, which is already linked up in brotherhood against the bourgeoisie of all other countries, and Herr Bismarck's international policy of conspiracy. In fact, the internationalism of the program stands even infinitely below that of the Free Trade Party. The latter also asserts that the result of this effort will be the international brotherhood of peoples. But it also does something to make trade international and by no means contents itself with the consciousness that all people are carrying on trade at home. The international activity of the working classes does not in any way depend on the existence of International Working Men's Association. This was only the first attempt to create a central organ for the activity, an attempt which was a lasting success on account of the impulse in which it gave, but was no longer realizable in its historical form after the fall of the Paris Commune. Bismarck's Norddeutsch was absolutely right when it announced to the satisfaction of its master that the German Worker Party had sworn off internationalism in the new program. So, another side note, in this last section, Marx talks about the international solidarity amongst the communist movement. And this was even before the development of fully into monopoly imperialist capitalism. Marx correctly points out that it is the workers of a particular nation's job to oppose their national bourgeoisie. It is not the position of a worker in, say, Germany to oppose the bourgeoisie of Turkey or Russia. It is up to the masses to liberate ourselves in our present conditions, our present locales and geographical locations, and the nation states, the bourgeois states, which hold us captive. This is why the contradictory absolute nonsense of patriotic socialism, so-called patriotic socialism, is completely anti-revolutionary. One cannot hold any sort of particular allegiance to the bourgeois state while claiming also to oppose it and support its overthrow by the toiling masses.